Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today we're going to continue Series Port Authority, where I take a look at my favorite arcade games compared to their home console ports. And today we've got a really fun and really interesting one, because we're comparing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time, on the arcade version from Konami as well as the home port. And this is one of the most interesting home conversions ever, because it basically takes the bones of the arcade game, expands upon it, adds other elements that were not able to be made in the arcade version due to time, and just makes a bigger game that in some instances is much better, and in other instances is graphically inferior. Before I get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. Right off the top, we're playing the arcade version of this game, and both the arcade and the Super Nintendo port play exactly the same off the first couple levels, but from there they absolutely branch apart and become almost different games even though they are the same. And obviously no home conversion was ever going to get away without some graphical downgrades, and while Konami did an excellent job harnessing the power of the Super Nintendo here with the port, you can tell that the colors take a hit as well as the overall density of enemies on screen and details in the background. So as far as stage 1 is concerned, side by side, I'm going to give it to the arcade board on this one. When Crane comes through with his laser eyes, it is just such a ton of fun. And the best part is Konami was able to translate that sensation of fun perfectly over to the Super Nintendo, even if it did have to take a bit of a graphical downgrade. The other huge difference outside of the level structure in the Super Nintendo having more game is the fact that it is a 2-player game versus the arcade original, which can be played with 4 players at the same time. So if you have 3 friends, you're going to have a little bit more fun. But as we put these things side by side, the arcade version on the left, the Super Nintendo version on the right, you're going to see the characters within the Super Nintendo version did grow a life bar, as well as some quotes when they fly into the screen for the boss battle, but otherwise these are basically almost at par. MAME takes a little bit of an edge as far as the arcade board is concerned, but the Super Nintendo version is definitely holding up. Now we'll get into some of the major differences in just a moment, but I want to still talk about the graphical differences and how good of a port this truly was for Konami. Here on the Super Nintendo version, we have this New York City alleyway, we have the hydrants and all of the Foot Clan soldiers jumping through those doors. And if we move over to the arcade version, we have the exact same gameplay with just a little bit more detail in the background. But obviously this arcade board was much more powerful than a Super Nintendo at the time, so the fact that most of this comes over completely intact, including all of the throwing the enemies at the screen, is just awesome. Although I will say that some levels in the Super Nintendo version can feel a little bit more drab color-wise than the arcade original, but leave me a comment down below and you tell me what you think. Now pay attention to this manhole here. One of the turtles can fall inside of it and basically lose some life, where on the arcade version those manholes never exist, but you do get a different enemy. Really, these are two sides of the same coin as far as the game is concerned, and honestly you should be playing both of them. I will pick a winner at the end of the video, but honestly there is no bad version of Turtles in Time. The only bad version is the one you don't play. And you'll see here on the arcade variant with that spinning attack, all of the gameplay again comes over, but we just lose a little bit of that color. That red on the brick is just a little bit more flat and monotone than we see on the arcade side of things. But this is the fun thing about comparing these two releases. You will see here on the boss side of things, on the Super Nintendo, I'm not able to get a stun lock in the corner. A lot of Konami beat 'em ups and beat 'em ups from back in the day always had different ways to cheese the bosses. Now maybe there's a secondary method I am not aware of here, so leave me a comment down below and you tell me, but I'm trying to do what I would do in the arcade version and stun lock him into the corner, which I wasn't able to do. But here on the arcade board, I'm able to stun lock, jump when I need to, and basically treat this as a completely free victory. So in some instances, the enemy AI has been changed for the home console version. In some ways it makes the game easier, in some ways it makes the game harder. But interestingly, we moved to a completely different level in the Super Nintendo version, which you're watching here, and I'm not putting logos up for which game is which. I find them visually distracting, so you'll just have to listen to me. But the reason that the Super Nintendo version often comes out ahead in people's opinions, and in some instances mine as well, is there's just more gameplay here. It's the exact same arcade experience you know, love, and remember with additions, and you'll see the two bosses here are going to appear in a place that they do not appear in the arcade version. version. Once you get to the end of the pirate ship, you're going to see these enemies again, and in the Super Nintendo version it would be Bebop and Rocksteady. So there are some pivots as far as where bosses appear, and in some instances there's brand new bosses in the Super Nintendo version you're never going to see in the arcade original, and only one of these has an elevator level. And you know what I always say about beat 'em ups, it's not a true beat 'em up if you don't have an elevator, so this gives the Super Nintendo version an edge, although honestly it is just a way to artificially prolong the gameplay. But this battle against Shredder, where you need to throw Foot Clan members into the screen in that Mode 7 effect, is completely new for the Super Nintendo version, and one of the main reasons to play this over the arcade. It just has more, and it is every bit as good as what you got in the arcade release. And it's at this point in time that Shredder is going to send you back in time, which happens at a completely different point in the arcade game once you get the end of the sewer hoverboard riding levels. So the game's structure, overall narrative is the same, but where you go and when you go to those places does completely change from version to version. And it really is interesting to play these side by side so you can understand exactly where you're going and where you came from. And once we get to the prehistoric level, I will say this is one area in which the arcade board absolutely dominates the Super Nintendo release as far as the graphical fidelity is concerned. This is absolutely gorgeous here with all of the detail, and while the Super Nintendo version is no slouch in and of itself, the amount of detail in the background and the overall color is shrunk down to fit the hardware of the Super Nintendo, and in this one level I would say it's at the detriment to the original art for the gameplay. Does not affect the fun whatsoever, but it does just not look as good, and that's definitely something that you would expect back in the day from an arcade port to a home console, but still a bummer that a lot of that background detail was lost. And honestly, these foreground trees I find distracting sometimes with the enemy sprites. But as we move further into the game, you get a completely different gameplay style between the arcade and the Super Nintendo, because the Super Nintendo had Mode 7 scrolling, where of course the arcade board did not. So this hoverboard ride leading up to Krang is completely different. But let's talk about the audio differences as well. The first audio samples are going to be the arcade, the second Super Nintendo, and I'll see you guys once we get into that fight with Krang. Honestly, for me, it's hard to pick a better version between the arcade and the Super Nintendo. They are just different, they've got different sound hardware, and they are both compelling in their own rights. Will you leave me a comment down below and tell me if you could pick one soundtrack from what you just heard, which one it would be? Now, as we move into the Krang boss fight, it's going to be exactly the same, but you are going to have those Mode 7 effects with those foreground and background roads going into the distance left to right, so you get a really good sense of perspective here. And I will say the Krang sprite looks identical from the Super Nintendo to the arcade. Maybe it's ever so slightly smaller, but honestly, the arcade board was a powerhouse for when it released, so the fact that the Super Nintendo can keep up this well is absolutely something that should be commended. And that is why this is considered one of the best arcade beat-em-ups of all time, along with one of the best Super Nintendo beat-em-ups of all time. It was an incredible if unfinished game in the arcades, and when Konami brought it home to home consoles, they were able to improve upon it, realize some of the ideas they did not have time for in the arcades, and give you a bigger, fuller experience for Turtles in Time, with just a few downgrades in the graphics and in some instances some upgrades as well, because Mode 7 here is just more impressive. Now, other strange things in the Super Nintendo version, at the end of the sewer, you're going to have a fight with the Rat King. He's going to be the boss here, where in the arcade version, like I just showed you previously, he is not here whatsoever. So you're going to get a couple extra boss fights as well. Most importantly, that Shredder Mode 7 fight, as well as the Rat King here. And that is interesting. Same gameplay, just expanded, where we move over to the arcade version, and once you get done fighting what's definitely not copyright infringing xenomorphs from the Alien franchise, Shredder is going to send you back in time time from here. So it's kind of like Konami ran out of time in the arcade version. It had to move you on a little bit faster than in the Super Nintendo version. So the overall act structure of the levels is just going to vary. And if you take a look here again at that prehistoric level, you just end up in different places at different times with the Super Nintendo footage here. But I'm going to give you one more sound sample in the prehistoric area so you can hear where the tracks completely differ. Sometimes the music's going to be 1-to-1 as far as what track's playing. Sometimes the arcade version versus the Super Nintendo version are going to have different music. So I'm going to let you listen to the Super Nintendo version first, then we'll move over to the arcades, and I'll come back and tell you what version of the game I would play if I had just one.
Red Cake Shell!
Both similar yet different, both good music quality even if they have different sound hardware, but again, on the arcade side of things, this level just looks that much better. But the question really is, are better graphics worth playing one version over the other, or is more content and a more realized version of Turtles in Time worth playing over the arcade version? Now that's something everyone gets to choose for themselves, but the great part is there actually are two versions of this game. We don't live in a world in which one is going to disappear just because I am comparing them in port authority. So my recommendation honestly is you should play both. I recommend the arcade version first, and then move over to the Super Nintendo version to find out what Turtles in Time would have been like in the arcades had Konami not seemed to have run out of a little bit of time developing the game and having to ship it before it was 100% complete. But if you made me go out back behind the shed and old yeller one of the releases of this game and keep 1A alive, I'm keeping the Super Nintendo one, and unfortunately the arcade version has to go. And that's not to say that the arcade original isn't a spectacular game, it is one of my favorites of all time. And even if the Super Nintendo version doesn't have as good a graphics, it has more content, more gameplay, and when it does have extra levels, like this Mode 7 feature here, it just looks incredible. So you leave me a comment down below, you tell me what you pick, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.